Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. A quick stock taking of Foreign Minister Bilawal Bhutto Zardari's trip to Goa to attend the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's meeting. So he basically three main engagements there. One, he attended the SCO, he made a speech there. He talked about the importance of connectivity and he spoke about what prevents connectivity. Basically, when you have countries in the region that violate or go against the Security Council, UN Security Council resolution, or those that are not interested in resolving disputes in the region, let those disputes fester. Those countries and those actions become a reason for preventing connectivity. So he talked about that. Clearly, his signaling was towards India, and that India and the issue of Kashmir. He did not name Kashmir, but there he was talking about that problem. Then there was his press conference with the Pakistani journalists, and he met the Pakistani journalists there. There were a dozen plus, and he answered their questions. Three things, important things he said. Number one, SCO regional connectivity, very important, and we wanted to show our commitment, so I'm here. Number two, he said he'd had good meetings with the Russian, Chinese foreign minister and other foreign ministers on the sidelines. No meeting with the Indian foreign minister, he hadn't asked for one. Number three, he spoke about Pakistan-India relations, saying that the policy of the previous governments regarding no normalization of ties with India until India reviews what it's done in the Indian occupied Kashmir in terms of unilaterally subverting the UN resolution and breaking up the state and basically making it part of the Indian Union. He said unless that changes, there's going to be no normalization. And then he spoke of Pakistan's Kashmir policy, saying that it was really about the UN resolutions, and outside of that it's not going to work, and India will have to adhere to that. That's the basis of the whole question of Kashmir. And the third thing he did, which I thought was perhaps the most important, he talked to Rajdeep Sardesai. The interview we saw, he chose not to meet the Indian media collectively, or at least he didn't meet them. It was a wise thing for whatever reason that it didn't happen, because if you would have had the entire Indian media, then basically there would have been a lot of screaming, shouting, given the environment right now, given the belligerence that we had heard even before the foreign minister had arrived in Delhi. In Goa he'd made that comment in New York about the Indian Prime Minister that Bujar of Gujarat is alive, OBL is dead, because something was said about Pakistan being the center of terrorism by Mr. Jaishankar, the Indian Foreign Minister. Anyway, so he spoke to Rajdeep Sardesai. Those of you who are interested in Pakistan-India relations ought to look at that interview. It's an interesting interview from four perspectives. Number one, it shows the state of the Indian belligerence, and Rajdeep Sardesai, who's a friend and who's normally kind of, he's very polite, etc. You should see the tone in which he's addressing the Pakistani Foreign Minister. A lot of kind of aggression and excitement, and I think the Foreign Minister used the word hyper, that you're being hyper, and indeed he was. And then the Foreign Minister focused on conveying what Pakistan's policy was on Kashmir, making the point very clearly that India is not only violating the UN resolutions, but India's really focused on what he said, some refer to it as ethnic cleansing, and that reducing the numerical superiority of the Kashmiris and basically bringing in non-Kashmiris and gerrymandering, the word he used, with the constituencies there to basically mess around with the elections, and that human rights activists, Kashmiris, were behind bars, and all the state atrocities, etc., being committed on the Kashmiris. So he spoke at length about that, saying that given all of this, there's no question of any normalization. And when he was pushed to on the point that Pakistan was supposed to withdraw its forces if a plebiscite were to be held, and not just India, he said Pakistan is absolutely willing and that he would lead the movement asking for movement of Pakistani armed forces from Gilgit-Baltistan and from Azad Kashmir in case India were to agree to a plebiscite. So at that point he made clearly, he talked about the minorities and minorities and minority rights, referred to the problems in India. When he was asked, well, why did you make this statement about the Indian Prime Minister, about butcher, and he did not say, I did not say the words, but he said, I quoted some of the Indian people who've used the word butcher of Gujarat, and that it isn't my language, but I use that language. And he emphasized the point that the problem is still there and that Pakistan was a big deal issue. Pakistan bashing was a vote getter in Indian elections, while this is not the case in Pakistan. And on terrorism, he talked about when he was being pushed, you're not doing anything on Mumbai, you're not doing anything on various other issues, and on Dawood Ibrahim, who I believe is dead, I think. This wasn't brought out in the interview, but it seemed that Rajdeep said this. I didn't know that, and the Pakistani Foreign Minister also didn't say that he's dead. But anyway, he said very clearly that India has still to, give justice to people Pakistanis who got killed at the Godhra Express. And then he talked about Kulbhushan Yadav, who he said was not a non-state actor. He was very clearly a naval guy in the service of the Indian state. So Bilawal Bhutto very clearly put across Pakistan's point, and one has to say this very sadly. I mean, that what it basically demonstrated was that this relationship is in a freeze mode, and there's no kind of moving forward in terms of normalization. If India thinks that it can, basically, take the position that Pakistan has to just accept the status quo, Pakistan is not going to accept the status quo. The interesting thing in all of this, of course, is, and there was a question about CPEC also, and the Indian Foreign Minister had talked about CPEC and that it's not acceptable, that it's disputed territory. So India is obviously very confused. On the one hand, it talks about Jammu Kashmir disputed territory, and then saying it's our territory, and then saying it's not an issue, and that the Kashmir issue is not an issue. So there's a lot of confusion in the Indian ranks. But Pakistani Foreign Minister made it clear that Pakistan was going to stay with CPEC. CPEC was important, was very central in Pakistan's economic development, and obviously a key factor, key pillar in Pakistan-China relations. And then just to conclude this, it was not entirely unexpected, but I would say that one didn't expect the Indian Foreign Minister to go into such a rage and end up being the hyperbolic things he said after Bilawal Bhutto gave the press conference with the Pakistani journalists and made all these points about Kashmir, about Pakistan-India relations. The Indian Foreign Minister in his press conference, and he just lashed out, saying that the Pakistani Foreign Minister was supporting terrorism, was justifying terrorism, and was a spokesperson for the industry of terrorism. I mean, really, come on, it's just so unfortunate, almost pathetic, because you, as a foreign minister, as a host, is that how you talk to your guests? And in any case, that hysteria, does that score you many numbers? Maybe in your domestic politics to some extent, but in substance, in resolution of the issue in terms of India-Pakistan relations, certainly not. And the contrast between a man who was half his age, Bilawal Bhutto, he was completely well composed, poised, calm, and saying on substantive issues what needed to be said. And Mr. Jaishankar really flew off the handle, just too angry. And on that note, I think it's just to illustrate, just too angry. That's the Indian position on this relationship and how it seems to think it will conduct the relationship, while Pakistan ought to stay calm, cool, and firm, and that's what it seems Pakistan is going to do. But just to end on a somewhat hopeful note, let's see what the SCO brings for these countries, the two countries. Shanghai Cooperation Organization is a serious emerging global organization, and these two countries, Pakistan and India, actually cooperate. RATS, the structure for anti-terrorism, their forces make contributions towards this structure, and when it holds joint exercises against terrorism. So let's see whether SCO will create enough space that within that space you will have some resolution, some movement towards the resolution of the problem of Kashmir. But I mean, one can only hope. Meanwhile, the Bhutto trip to Goa and the Indian response and the Indian Foreign Minister's response tells you the state of play right now. On this note, we'll say goodbye. Khuda Hafiz.